The bell above the door doesn't jingle, it clatters, a sharp brass announcement that cuts through the quiet of the morning. You're standing on a cobblestone street just as the sun begins to bleed orange across the rooftops, and your hand is still on the cold iron handle of the apothecary shop. The smell hits you before anything else does, a complex fog of dried lavender, bitter aloes, something sweet and sticky like honey, and underneath it all, a chemical sharpness that makes your nostrils prickle. You step inside, and the door swings shut behind you with a solid thunk that seals you off from the outside world. The shop is dim after the pale dawn light. Your boots scrape against wide plank floors that have been scrubbed so many times the wood has gone soft and silver with age. To your left, a counter runs the length of the room, its surface worn smooth by countless elbows and coin-counting palms. Behind that counter, you see him, the apothecary himself, a man in a dark waistcoat with sleeves rolled to the forearm, already at work despite the early hour. He doesn't look up immediately. He's pouring something from a stoneware jar into a smaller bottle, using a glass funnel that catches the light from a single oil lamp. His hands are steady, deliberate, and you find yourself holding your breath so you don't make him jump. The bell was your doing, and now you're committed. You're here because your head has been pounding for 3 days, a dull thud behind your eyes that sleep won't touch. A neighbor told you about this place, said the man who runs it knows things the regular doctors won't bother with. But as you stand here, taking in the sheer volume of what surrounds you, you start to wonder if you've made a mistake. The shelves stretch from floor to ceiling, every inch of them occupied. Bottles of blue glass, green glass, clear glass with tiny handwritten labels that curl at the edges. Drawers with brass pulls, dozens of them, each one marked with Latin words you can't quite pronounce. Ceramic jars with lids shaped like animals. Bundles of dried plants hanging from ceiling hooks, brushing against the top of your head if you stand too tall. It's organized, you can feel that much, but the system is completely invisible to you. The apothecary finally looks up. He has steady eyes, the kind that have spent decades measuring things by sight alone. "You're up early," he says. Not a question, just an observation. His voice is calm, unhurried, like the rest of him. You explain about the headache, the 3 days, the neighbor's recommendation. He listens without interrupting, his gaze flicking briefly to your pupils, the color of your cheeks, the way you're holding your shoulders. Then he nods once and reaches for a ladder on brass rails that runs along the shelves. You watch him climb, his weight steady on the rungs, and you realize he knows exactly where he's going. No hesitation, no scanning the labels. His hand goes to a particular bottle on a particular shelf, third from the top, second from the left, and brings it down like he's retrieving a familiar tool. This is not a place where you browse. This is a place where you state your ailment and wait. The apothecary uncorks the bottle and tips a small amount of dried material onto a piece of paper on the counter. It looks like tiny brown flowers, or maybe the buds of something you'd walk past without noticing. "Feverfew," he says, answering the question you hadn't asked yet. "Chew a pinch of this. Not too much, or you'll have sores in your mouth." He wraps the paper into a neat packet, folding the edges with quick, precise movements. You fumble for coins, and he names a price so low you wonder if you misheard. But you pay it, because the headache is still there and you're willing to try anything. Historians still argue whether the average 19th century apothecary was more healer or merchant. The truth probably sits somewhere in the middle. A man who had to keep the lights burning and the rent paid while also trying not to accidentally poison his customers. You look around again, and this time you notice details you missed before. The small desk in the corner with a ledger open on it, columns of numbers written in careful script. The mortar and pestle sitting on the counter, still dusted with residue from whatever was ground earlier. The glass jar of leeches on a low shelf, dark shapes shifting lazily in the water. The apothecary follows your gaze and offers the faintest hint of a smile. "There for later," he says. Yours is a simple case. Feverfew, a good night's sleep, and you'll be right as rain by tomorrow. You tuck the paper packet into your pocket, feeling its slight weight against your thigh. As you turn to leave, your hand reaches for the door handle, and you hesitate for just a moment. The bell will clatter again when you open it, and you'll be back on the cobblestones, back in the world of ordinary sounds and ordinary smells. But for now, you're still inside this dim, orderly universe where every bottle has a place and every ailment has a corresponding drawer. The apothecary has already turned away, climbing the ladder again to replace the feverfew bottle on its exact shelf. He doesn't watch you leave. He doesn't need to. The bell will tell him when you're gone, and by then, he'll be on to the next task, the next measurement, the next quiet transaction in a day full of them. You push the door open. The bell clatters. And you step out into the growing light, the taste of lavender still faint in the back of your throat. Behind the counter, you find yourself in a universe of bottles. Now that your headache has a temporary remedy tucked safely in your pocket, you have the luxury of looking, truly looking, at the organized chaos surrounding you. The apothecary has moved to the far end of the counter, where he's decanting a dark liquid from a large carboy into smaller containers, but he doesn't seem to mind your lingering presence. Perhaps he's used to customers standing exactly where you're standing, mouths slightly open, eyes trying and failing to take in everything at once. The bottles line the walls in regiments. On the highest shelves, beyond the reach of the ladder's top rung, sit the largest vessels, demijohns wrapped in wicker, their contents mysterious and dark. Below them, row after row of glass containers in every shade the 19th century can produce. The deep cobalt blue that signals poison to those who know the code, the emerald green that holds tinctures made with alcohol, the amber that protects light-sensitive compounds from degradation. Clear glass too, plenty of it, displaying powders in shades of white and grey and pale yellow. The labels are handwritten, each one a tiny work of penmanship. You lean closer to one and read Pulvis Ipecacuanhi in flowing script, the letters shaded with the precision of a steel nib. You have no idea what it means, but it looks important. Your eyes travel downward, past the bottles and into the realm of drawers. There are hundreds of them, fitted into a wooden cabinet that spans the entire back wall. Each drawer has a brass pull, polished to a soft gleam by generations of fingers, and each one bears a label in that same careful hand. Some labels are older, yellowed and cracked, while others look fresh and white. You realize this collection didn't spring into existence overnight. It grew over decades, added to and refined as the apothecary's knowledge expanded. A drawer labeled Cortex catches your eye, and you wonder what kind of bark lives inside. Another says radix with a subscript you can't quite make out. Roots, you guess. A whole drawer full of dried and powdered roots. The apothecary glances up from his decanting. If you're going to stand there gawking, you might as well be useful. Tell me what you see on the third shelf, second row from the top. You squint upward, counting shelves until you find the one he means. Bottles of pale blue glass, all roughly the same size, their labels turned away from you. Bottles, you say. He almost smiles. Yes, but what kind? Look at the shapes. You look again, and now you notice the differences. Some are tall and narrow, some short and squat, some with long necks and some with practically none. They're not all the same, you offer. No, he agrees. The tall ones hold oils. The short, wide ones hold syrups. The ones with ground glass stoppers hold acids and volatile chemicals. The stopper creates a seal that keeps the vapors in. The ones with corks hold everything else. He returns to his work, and you realize he just taught you something without ever raising his voice or pausing his hands. Historians still argue about the standardization of 19th century apothecary practices. Some shops were models of meticulous organization, while others apparently operated on a system that involved sniffing every bottle until the right smell turned up. But the best apothecaries understood that organization wasn't just about finding things quickly, it was about safety. Put a poison in the wrong bottle, or store it next to something harmless with a similar appearance, and you might not live to regret your mistake. You notice now that the bottles on the lowest shelves are mostly clear glass, easily visible, containing what look like common household items. Epsom salts, baking soda, something labeled sulfur in bright yellow letters. Child height. You think. Things a parent might need in a hurry, or things harmless enough that a toddler's curious fingers wouldn't cause disaster. The apothecary finishes his decanting and wipes his hands on a cloth tucked into his apron strings. He joins you at the counter, following your gaze as it travels across his domain. It's a map, he says quietly. Every shop has its own geography. A stranger walks in and sees nothing but clutter. The man who works here sees a city he built himself. He points to a section of shelves on the far left. Over there, the simples, single ingredients, uncompromised. A patient who knows what he needs can come in and buy feverfew or valerian or chamomile by the ounce. His finger moves to the center. There, the compounds. Mixtures I prepare myself, based on recipes I've collected over the years. Some doctors send their prescriptions, others trust my judgment. Finally he gestures to the lowest shelves, the ones near the floor. And there, the common goods. Things people use at home for cleaning or cooking or keeping moths out of their woolens. They come for the borax and leave with a bottle of cough syrup they didn't know they needed. You notice something you missed before. A small section of the counter near the cash box holds bottles that look different from the rest. They're smaller, more decorative, with labels printed rather than handwritten. Patent medicines, the apothecary says, following your look. Not my work, but people ask for them. They see the advertisements in newspapers, read the testimonials, and decide they want that specific bottle with that specific name. His tone carries no judgment, but you detect a faint weariness. Most of them contain the same ingredients I'd give you for a fraction of the price. But the bottles are pretty, and the names are memorable, and sometimes that's what sells. He shrugs. A man has to make a living. You think about the sheer volume of knowledge required to maintain this system. Every bottle's contents, every drawer's powder, every label's Latin name. All of it living in one man's head, accessible the moment someone walks through the door and describes their symptoms. You look at the apothecary differently now, seeing not just a shopkeeper but a librarian of the human body, a curator of cures that range from the genuinely effective to the hopelessly optimistic. He catches your expression and tilts his head. It's not as impressive as it looks, he says. Start with one shelf. Learn everything on it. Then move to the next. After 30 years, you know where everything lives. He pauses. Of course, by then you've also learned that some of what's in those bottles doesn't work, no matter how carefully you arrange them. He turns back to his work, and you're left alone with the bottles again. The morning light has grown stronger, slanting through the front window and setting the colored glass aglow. Cobalt bleeds into emerald, amber warms the clear bottles, and for a moment the entire shop looks like a stained glass window exploded into 3 dimensions. You breathe in the complex air, lavender and licorice and something sharp you can't name, and you understand, just for an instant, why a man would devote his life to this map of remedies. It's beautiful in its way, this universe of bottles. Dangerous too, but mostly beautiful. The apothecary gestures you closer to the counter, and now you notice something you overlooked in your initial awe of the bottles and drawers. There, sitting on a square of polished marble, is a set of brass scales so delicate they look like they belong in a jewelry shop rather than a place of medicine. The balance beam catches the light, and the 2 pans hang perfectly still, waiting for someone to place a weight upon them. You lean in, And the apothecary watches you with the patience of a man who has seen this fascination 1,000 times before. "Go ahead," he says. "Touch them. They won't bite." You reach out and gently nudge one of the pans. It swings slightly, and the beam tips, then slowly rocks back to equilibrium. The movement is almost hypnotic, the way the brass catches light as it swings, the soft click as it settles. You withdraw your hand, and the apothecary steps forward to demonstrate. From a drawer beneath the counter, he produces a set of tiny weights, each one nestling into its own velvet-lined compartment in a wooden box. They're beautiful in their precision, squares of brass with curled corners for picking up, stamped with numbers so small you have to squint to read them. 1 grain, 2 grains, 5 grains, all the way up to an ounce. He selects a 2-grain weight, about the mass of a single grain of rice, and places it carefully in the center of the left pan. The pan dips, then steadies. From another drawer, he produces a small paper envelope and tips its contents onto the right pan. It's a fine white powder, almost weightless in appearance. He adds a pinch, then another, watching the beam like a hawk watches a field. The right pan begins to rise as the powder accumulates, and you realize he's adding material until the beam hangs perfectly level. When it does, he stops instantly, his hand freezing in midair as if suspended by an invisible thread. 2 grains exactly, he murmurs, more to himself than to you. He folds the paper, taps the remaining powder back into its drawer, and hands you the envelope. "For your headache tonight, if the feverfew isn't enough. Willow bark powder. Mix it with a little honey and warm water." You take the envelope, feeling its negligible weight. 2 grains. You could hold it on your fingertip and barely notice it was there. Yet this tiny amount of powdered bark, carefully measured on scales that cost more than most laborers earn in a month, might ease your pain more effectively than anything else in the shop. You look at the scales again, understanding them differently now. They're not just tools, they're the difference between a remedy and a poison. A grain too much of the wrong substance, and you might find yourself doubled over with cramps. A grain too little, and you might as well have eaten a mouthful of dust. The apothecary notices your expression and nods slowly. "You're beginning to understand," he says. "People think this work is about knowing which herb treats which ailment. That's the easy part. The hard part is knowing how much. A patient comes in with a cough that's kept him awake for a week. I give him ipecacuanha. 1 grain will make him vomit, which clears the lungs in certain cases. But if I give him 2 grains, he's vomiting for hours, and he'll be too weak to cough at all. If I give him half a grain, nothing happens. The difference between useless, helpful, and harmful is often smaller than the width of my fingernail." He demonstrates by taking out a small magnifying glass and holding it over the balance beam. You see now that the beam has a tiny pointer at its center, and the base has a scale marked with lines so fine they're almost invisible. The pointer hovers just above the center line when the pans are equal, and you realize the apothecary isn't just watching for the beam to level, he's watching for the pointer to align perfectly with that hair-thin mark. "Temperature affects it," he continues, warming to his subject. "A warm room makes the beam expand, throws off the balance. So does humidity, if the pans get a film of moisture. I check the zero every morning with nothing on the pans, and I adjust this screw at the base until it's perfect." He points to a small brass thumbscrew beneath the beam. Some apothecaries keep their scales in glass cases to protect them from drafts. I tried that once, but the glass reflected the lamplight and I couldn't see the pointer clearly. So now they sit here, and I just don't open the door on windy days. Historians still argue whether the average 19th century apothecary's measurements were accurate enough to matter. Some surviving prescription ledgers show doses that would make a modern pharmacist blanch, enormous quantities of mercury, opium, and other potent substances that seem reckless by today's standards. But the counter-argument notes that the best apothecaries understood their materials intimately, and they adjusted doses based on the patient's age, weight, and apparent constitution. The scales weren't just for show. They were the physical manifestation of that understanding, the point where knowledge became action. You watch as the apothecary performs another weighing, this time for a customer who enters while you're still standing there. The man is older, with a hacking cough that shakes his entire frame. He doesn't need to explain his symptoms. The apothecary takes one look at him and reaches for a particular drawer. Squill. You hear him murmur. And squill it is, a bulb from a Mediterranean plant that looks like an onion and acts as an expectorant when prepared correctly. But the preparation is everything. The apothecary crumbles a dried piece of the bulb onto the scale, adding tiny fragments until the beam balances at exactly the weight he wants. Then he crushes it further in a small mortar, adds honey to make a paste, and rolls the mixture into pills small enough to swallow. The whole process takes perhaps 5 minutes, and at the end, the old man walks out with a week's supply of medicine wrapped in paper and string. The old man pays with coins that look like they represent a significant portion of his weekly earnings. You watch him count them out, one by one, and you realize that these measurements aren't just about biology, they're about economics too. Too little medicine, and the patient wastes his money on ineffective treatment. Too much, and you poison him, which is bad for business in addition to being morally catastrophic. The apothecary has to hit the exact center of a target that's invisible, using tools that cost more than many families spend on food in a month, and he has to do it while a coughing man stands waiting and the morning light shifts across the counter and the bell above the door clatters with the arrival of the next customer. He catches you staring at the scales again as the old man leaves. "They're French," he says, with a hint of pride in his voice. "Best ones made. The beam is aircraft. I mean, it's made of an alloy that doesn't expand much with heat. The pans are brass, but they're hammered thin to reduce weight. The whole thing cost me 6 months of savings when I was starting out." He runs a finger along the beam, almost tenderly. "I've never regretted it. There are things you can do with good scales that you can't do with bad ones. Measure smaller amounts, for one thing. Children need smaller doses, and if your scales aren't sensitive enough, you can't treat them safely. Some apothecaries just guess for children, or tell the parents to use a pinch. I can give them a proper dose, measured properly, and sleep soundly afterward." He returns the weights to their velvet box, closes the lid, and slides it back into its drawer. The scales sit on their marble square, gleaming in the morning light, ready for the next patient, the next measurement, the next narrow line between healing and harming. You touch the envelope of willow bark in your pocket, feeling its tiny weight, and you understand that you're carrying more than just powdered bark. You're carrying the result of 6 months of savings, 30 years of experience, and the steady hand of a man who learned to trust his instruments because his life and the lives of his customers depend on that trust every single day. The rhythm starts before you're fully aware of it. A low, grinding sound that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. You look around the shop, trying to locate its source, and finally your eyes settle on the apothecary's hands. He's returned to his work behind the counter, and in one of those hands is a heavy mortar made of dark stone, veined with white like a map of some distant country. In the other hand, a pestle that looks like it's been shaped by decades of the same circular motion. He's grinding something, and the sound is surprisingly musical. A steady crunch 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 that rises and falls as he varies the pressure. You step closer, drawn by the sound and by the smell that's beginning to emanate from the mortar. It's sharp and green, like crushed leaves mixed with something resinous. The apothecary glances up briefly, then returns his attention to the work. His hand moves in a steady circle, pressing the pestle against the inside of the mortar, crushing whatever's inside against the curved stone wall. You watch the muscles in his forearm shift under the skin, and you realize this isn't just casual work. It's a skill developed over thousands of repetitions, each motion efficient and precise. This is the heart of it, he says, not pausing in his rhythm. Anyone can buy powdered herbs from a supplier. Most do, these days. Comes in sacks, already ground, ready to measure and sell. But powdered herbs lose their potency faster than whole ones. The essential oils evaporate. The active compounds oxidize. A month after grinding, that powder is half as strong as it was when fresh. 3 months, and you might as well be selling sawdust. He reaches into a small sack beside him and pulls out a handful of what look like dried roots, brown and twisted and about the length of your little finger. These are valerian roots. I'll grind what I need for today. Maybe a little extra for tomorrow. The rest stay whole until someone asks for them. He drops a few roots into the mortar and resumes grinding. The smell shifts, becoming earthier, almost musky. You recognize it vaguely. Valerian is supposed to help with sleep, though you've heard it smells like old socks. Now you understand why. The odor that rises from the mortar is distinctly foot-like, but there's something else underneath it, a sweetness that almost compensates. The apothecary inhales deeply as he works, and you get the sense that he's not just tolerating the smell, he's reading it, using it to judge the progress of the grind. When the roots are broken down into a coarse powder, he stops and tilts the mortar so you can see inside. The powder is uneven, some particles larger than others, and you can still identify fragments of the original root. Not done yet, he says. First grind breaks it up. Second grind makes it fine. Third grind, if I need a really fine powder for pills or something that needs to dissolve quickly. He resumes the motion, but this time the rhythm changes. Faster, smaller circles, more pressure. The crunching sound becomes softer, more like sand shifting than rocks breaking. The powder in the mortar grows finer with each pass, until eventually it looks like something you'd find in a modern spice jar. The apothecary tests it by rubbing a pinch between his thumb and forefinger, then nods with satisfaction. Historians still argue about the extent to which 19th century apothecaries did their own compounding versus relying on pre-ground materials from wholesalers. The economics of the trade pushed in both directions. Grinding your own ingredients took time and labor, but it ensured quality and allowed you to offer fresher products than competitors who took shortcuts. The best shops probably did a mix of both, buying common items like licorice root in bulk powder form, but grinding rare or potent materials in-house to maintain control over the final product. What's certain is that the mortar and pestle was the universal symbol of the apothecary's trade, as recognizable as the barber's pole or the pawnbroker's 3 balls. You watch as the apothecary tips the finished powder onto a sheet of clean paper, then uses a small brush to sweep every last grain from the mortar. Nothing gets wasted in this shop. You've noticed that already. The brush is made of soft horsehair, bound with copper wire, and it's clearly designed specifically for this purpose. He folds the paper into a neat packet, writes something on it with a pencil, and sets it aside with others that have accumulated during the morning. Those are for Mrs. Ellison, he explains. She comes every 2 weeks for her nerves. I grind fresh each time, and she swears she can tell the difference. Maybe she can, maybe she can't, but she's been a customer for 15 years and I'm not about to start sending her to a wholesaler now. The mortar itself is a thing of beauty now that you have time to examine it closely. The stone is about 6 inches across at the mouth, tapering to a rounded bottom that sits securely in a wooden base. The inside surface is smooth as glass, polished by decades of grinding until it feels almost slippery to the touch. You run your finger along the rim and encounter a shallow groove worn into the stone, the place where countless pestles have rubbed against the same spot year after year. The pestle matches it, its grinding end shaped exactly to the curve of the mortar's interior. They're matched set, these two, inseparable after so many years of working together. This one was my grandfather's, the apothecary says, noticing your examination. He started in the trade back in the 1790s, when things were less regulated. Bought this mortar from an Italian carver who claimed it was made from volcanic stone from Mount Vesuvius. Probably wasn't true, but it's a good story and it's a good mortar, so I keep both. He lifts the pestle and holds it out for you to feel. It's heavier than it looks, dense and cool in your hand. The wood of the handle is worn smooth in a pattern that fits your grip surprisingly well, though the apothecary's hands are larger than yours. The handle's been replaced 3 times that I know of. The stone part outlasts everything else. My grandson will probably grind with this same pestle someday, assuming he decides to follow me into the business. He takes it back and returns it to the mortar with a soft clunk that sounds almost like a sigh. Then he reaches for another sack, this one containing what look like dried berries. Juniper, he says. Good for digestion, among other things. These need to be crushed, not ground too fine. The seeds are bitter if you break them open too much. He demonstrates, using the pestle in a gentle rocking motion rather than the circular grind you saw before. The berries pop softly under the pressure, releasing a fragrance that's completely different from the valerian, piney and clean, like a forest after rain. You inhale deeply, and for a moment the shop's complex air resolves into something almost simple. A customer enters while he's working, a woman with a basket on her arm, here for something mundane like baking soda or castor oil. She waits patiently while the apothecary finishes his current batch of crushed juniper, watching him work with the same quiet fascination you feel. When he's done, he wipes his hands, serves her in under a minute, and returns to the mortar as if no interruption occurred. The rhythm of the shop, you realize, is built around these tools. The bell rings, the customer leaves, and the grinding resumes exactly where it left off, as steady and reliable as a heartbeat. By the time you're ready to leave, your headache already fading, your pockets now holding 2 different remedies. The apothecary has worked through valerian, juniper, and something else you didn't catch, a pale root that left a faint licorice scent in the air. The mortar sits clean and empty on the counter, waiting for the next ingredient, the next prescription, the next moment when someone will need a specific powder ground to a specific fineness for a specific ailment. You touch your hat to the apothecary as you go, and he nods without looking up from the fresh handful of something he's just taken from a drawer. The grinding resumes behind you as the door closes, a soft rhythm that follows you out onto the street and stays in your head for blocks afterward. The apothecary catches you glancing toward the back of the shop, where a narrow doorway leads into shadows. You've been wondering about that doorway since you arrived. What lies beyond the public space, behind the organized shelves and gleaming scales? He follows your gaze and tilts his head in invitation. Go on, he says. Nothing back there that bites. Well, nothing that bites hard. He's making a joke, you think, though his face gives nothing away. You step through the doorway and find yourself in a different world entirely. The back room is larger than the shop itself, but it feels smaller because of what fills it. Plants hang from every available inch of ceiling, bundles of dried herbs suspended from hooks and rafters, their leaves rustling faintly in some invisible current of air. The smell here is more intense than out front, less filtered by distance and glass. You breathe in and taste sage, thyme, something minty, something floral you can't identify. Light filters through a high window, dusty and golden, illuminating the hanging plants from above so they cast shifting shadows on the floor. You feel like you've walked into a forest that someone decided to store upside down. The system of organization becomes apparent once your eyes adjust. The plants aren't just hanging randomly, they're grouped by type, or perhaps by season of harvest, or maybe by some other logic that's visible only to the person who put them here. One section holds nothing but flowering tops, lavender, chamomile, yarrow, their blossoms dried to a papery fragility. Another section holds leaves exclusively, sage, rosemary, thyme, mint, all bundled with twine and labeled with small tags. A third section holds roots and barks, suspended in mesh bags that allow air to circulate while keeping the contents contained. You reach up to touch a bundle of something that looks like parsley, and the apothecary's voice comes from behind you. Careful with that one. It's hemlock. You snatch your hand back as if burned. He steps past you, reaching up to adjust the bundle slightly. Not the poison hemlock that killed Socrates. That's a different plant, though related. This is water hemlock, which is actually more toxic. One leaf would probably kill you. Maybe two. But dried, it's less potent, and properly prepared it has uses. He doesn't elaborate on what those uses might be, and you don't ask. You just stand very still, suddenly aware that this room full of innocent-looking plants could kill you a dozen different ways before lunch. Historians still argue whether the average 19th century apothecary truly understood the toxicity of every plant they handled. Some survived into old age with all their faculties intact, suggesting they knew exactly what they were dealing with. Others left behind records of mysterious symptoms and unexplained deaths, their own or their customers'. The plant kingdom in those days was a minefield of lookalikes and misidentifications, and the difference between a healing dose and a fatal one often came down to knowing which species you were holding at any given moment. You look at the hemlock again, and this time you notice the small red ribbon tied around its bundle. A warning sign, perhaps, or just a marker for something that needs extra attention. The apothecary moves through the room like a man walking through his own memory. He touches a bundle here, sniffs another there, occasionally breaks off a tiny piece of leaf or flower and chews it thoughtfully. This is this year's harvest, he says, gesturing at the plants nearest the window. Freshest, highest up to catch the warmth. The older stuff is toward the back, where it's cooler and darker. I rotate through it through the winter. Use the oldest first, save the newest for when the potency starts to fade. You follow him deeper into the room, past hanging plants and onto shelves that line the walls. These hold jars and boxes, mostly labeled, containing materials that don't dry well on their own. Resins, gums, seeds, and things you can't identify at all. A wooden table dominates the center of the room, its surface scarred by years of cutting and chopping and grinding. A large mortar sits on it, even bigger than the one in the shop, along with a selection of knives, scissors, and tools you've never seen before. There's a device that looks like a small guillotine for cutting plant stems, and another that resembles a nutcracker designed by someone with a grudge against walnuts. A brass scale similar to the one out front stands in the corner, though this one is larger and less delicate, for weighing bulk materials rather than precise doses. This is where the real work happens, the apothecary says, leaning against the table. Out front is for customers. Back here is for the plants. I spend more hours in this room than anywhere else in the world, including my own bedroom. He gestures at a small cot pushed against one wall, neatly made up with a thin mattress and a wool blanket. Sometimes, when I'm in the middle of a complicated preparation or when a patient needs watching through the night, I just stay here. It's easier than going home and coming back. You look at the cot, then at the plants hanging above it, and you wonder what it would be like to sleep surrounded by all these drying herbs, their scent seeping into your dreams. The apothecary picks up a bundle from the table and hands it to you. It's lavender, you realize. The flowers are unmistakable, even dried. But these are different from the lavender in the shop, fresher somehow, more intensely purple. Smell it, he instructs. You bring it to your nose and inhale deeply. The scent floods your sinuses, clean and sharp and somehow calming. It's the same lavender you smelled earlier, but amplified, as if someone turned up the volume on a familiar song. That's the difference between dried flowers that have been sitting in a drawer for months and flowers that came down from the rafters last week. You can charge twice as much for the fresh dried stuff, and people will pay it, because they can smell the difference. He takes the lavender back and returns it to its place, then leads you to a corner of the room where a series of shallow drawers are built into the wall. These, he explains, contain seeds, thousands of them, sorted by plant and by year of harvest. He opens one at random, and you peer inside at tiny brown specks that could be almost anything. Mustard, he says. Grow your own if you want, but it's easier to buy. These are for customers who want to plant their own medicinal gardens. I sell them by the packet, along with instructions for growing and harvesting. He closes the drawer and opens another. Poppy seeds. These I don't sell. Well, I do, but only to people I know, and only in small quantities. He doesn't explain further, and you don't ask. The tour continues through the back room, past bins of dried roots and shelves of bottled tinctures waiting to be moved out front. You see things you recognize and many more that you don't. A jar of what looks like small dried lizards, a box of powdered something that might be mineral rather than vegetable, a rack of glass bottles containing liquids in every color of the rainbow. The apothecary explains some of them, glosses over others, and occasionally just shrugs when you point at something even he can't immediately identify. Part of the job, he says. You acquire things over the years. Sometimes you forget what they are, or why you bought them. But you keep them anyway, because the day you throw something out is the day someone walks in asking for exactly that. By the time you emerge back into the front shop, blinking in the relative brightness, you feel like you've traveled to another country and returned with souvenirs you don't quite understand. The apothecary resumes his place behind the counter as if nothing unusual has happened, and you're left standing there with the memory of hanging plants and the faint scent of lavender still clinging to your clothes. You reach into your pocket and touch the feverfew and willow bark, grateful now that they came from someone who understands the difference between a plant that heals and a plant that kills, and who knows how to keep them both in the same room without ever mixing them up. As you emerge from the back room, something catches your eye, a detail you missed before, tucked away in the corner of the main shop near the window. It's a cabinet, smaller than the others, but distinguished by two things: the heavy brass lock that secures its single drawer, and the fact that it sits slightly apart from the surrounding shelves, as if the other bottles and jars are giving it a wide berth. You don't need to ask what's inside. The apothecary notices your gaze and nods slowly. That one, he says, is why I sleep on that cot in the back sometimes. Not because of what's in there, but because of who might want it. He crosses to the cabinet and runs his hand over the lock, not opening it, just acknowledging its presence. Every shop has one. Every apothecary has to decide what goes in it, and who gets to take things out. You step closer, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and the faint unease that anything locked away always seems to generate. The wood of the cabinet is dark, probably walnut, and the brass lock is polished to a high shine, not from decorative intent, but from frequent use. The poison cabinet, you say. It's not a question. The apothecary tilts his head in acknowledgement. Among other things, poison is one category. Narcotics are another. Then there are things that aren't dangerous by themselves but become dangerous when combined with other things, or things that are perfectly safe for most people but could kill a specific customer with a specific condition. He taps the lock lightly. And then there are things that are perfectly safe for anyone, but which I keep locked up anyway because people believe they're dangerous, and belief can be as powerful as chemistry. He produces a key from his pocket, a heavy iron thing with a complicated bit, and inserts it into the lock. The mechanism turns with a solid click that sounds definitive, final. He pulls the drawer open, and you lean in to look. The inside is divided into compartments, each containing a bottle or jar. Unlike the rest of the shop, where labels face outward for easy identification, these labels face inward toward the back of the drawer. The apothecary has to tilt each bottle to read it, a deliberate inconvenience that forces him to handle every item individually before dispensing. Arsenic, he says, pointing to the first bottle. More common than you'd think. People use it for rat poison, for preserving hides, for improving their complexions, though that last one usually backfires eventually. He moves his finger to the next. Laudanum. Opium dissolved in alcohol. Essential for pain, for coughs, for diarrhea, for sleeplessness, for anxiety, for pretty much anything that ails you, according to some doctors. Also highly addictive, which is why it stays in here. Next compartment, strychnine. From the nux vomica tree. Stimulant in tiny doses, convulsant and killer in slightly larger ones. I use it maybe twice a year, always with more fear than confidence. He continues down the row, naming each substance with the casual familiarity of long acquaintance. Mercury compounds for syphilis treatments. Belladonna for eye examinations and for murder, depending on who's asking. Cyanide in small amounts for photography and, well, for other purposes that don't bear thinking about. Digitalis from foxglove leaves, a heart medicine where the difference between a therapeutic dose and a fatal one is smaller than the width of a fingernail. You listen, and you realize that this drawer contains enough poison to kill everyone in the neighborhood, possibly twice over. And it's all sitting here, in a wooden box, protected by a single brass lock that a determined child could probably pick with a hairpin. Don't look so worried, the apothecary says, noticing your expression. The lock isn't to keep people out. It's to remind me to be careful. Anyone who really wants what's in here could break the drawer open in 30 seconds with a hammer from my own toolbox. But the lock makes me pause, makes me think about what I'm doing every time I open it. That pause is the important part. He closes the drawer and turns the key, the click sounding again. Also, it keeps honest people honest. A customer who sees a locked cabinet understands that what's inside isn't for casual use. They don't ask for it unless they really need it, and they don't help themselves when my back is turned. Historians still argue about how tightly regulated poisons and narcotics were in the 19th century. The truth varied enormously by time and place. In some cities, apothecaries were required to keep detailed records of every sale of arsenic or opium, with witnesses to verify the purchaser's identity. In other places, you could walk into a shop and buy enough laudanum to kill a horse without anyone asking your name. The locked cabinet was often less a legal requirement and more a matter of personal ethics, a way for the apothecary to draw a line between his public role as healer and his private knowledge of how easily that healing could become harm. The apothecary returns the key to his pocket and pats it once, a habitual gesture you suspect he makes dozens of times a day. The real danger isn't from people breaking in, he says. It's from people who know exactly what they want and have a good reason for wanting it. A woman whose husband beats her comes in asking for arsenic to kill rats. A man whose mother is dying in agony comes in asking for enough laudanum to ease her passage. A doctor who's made a mistake and needs to cover it up comes in asking for something that will end a life quietly, with no questions asked. He looks at you directly. They all have good reasons. They all seem like honest people. And every time I unlock that drawer, I have to decide whether to believe them. You think about the weight of that responsibility, having to judge, in a moment, whether someone's story is true, whether their need is genuine, whether what they're asking for will be used as intended. The apothecary doesn't have police reports or background checks. He has a conversation across the counter, a few minutes of watching someone's eyes and listening to their voice. And on the basis of that, he decides whether to hand over something that could end a life. It's a terrible power, you realize, and one that he never asked for but can't escape. There was a man last year, the apothecary continues, his voice softer now. Came in asking for arsenic. Said he had a rat problem in his barn, needed enough to poison the whole nest. I sold it to him. He was a farmer. I'd known him for years. His barn was right there on the road where everyone could see it. 3 days later, his wife was dead. Arsenic poisoning, the coroner said. The farmer confessed eventually, said she'd been sick for months, suffering, and he couldn't stand to watch anymore. He used my arsenic to end it. He's quiet for a moment. I still don't know if I did the right thing selling it to him. He had rats. That part was true. I saw the damage myself once, when I visited. But he also had a dying wife, and I didn't know that part until it was too late. He shakes himself, as if throwing off a heavy coat, and his voice returns to its normal matter-of-fact tone. That's why the cabinet stays locked. That's why I think twice, and 3 times, and then again before I open it. Not because I'm afraid of thieves, but because I'm afraid of myself. Afraid that I'll make the wrong judgment, trust the wrong person, hand over the wrong bottle. The lock reminds me to be careful. The key reminds me that the choice is mine, every single time. He pats his pocket again, and you understand that the weight he feels there isn't just iron and brass. It's the weight of every decision he's ever made about that cabinet, and every decision he'll make in the future. You look at the cabinet one last time before you turn away. It sits there in the corner, innocuous, just another piece of furniture in a shop full of interesting things. But now you know what's inside, and more importantly, you know what it means to be the person who holds the key. The apothecary returns to his work, and you're left standing there with the knowledge that behind that ordinary wooden door lies the power to heal or harm, to ease suffering or end it, and that the difference between those outcomes often comes down to a single moment of judgment from a man in a waistcoat who just wants to get through the day without making a mistake he can't undo. The apothecary reaches beneath the counter and produces a book. Not just any book. This one is leather-bound, thick as your fist, with pages that show the rippled texture of having been dampened and dried multiple times over the years. He sets it on the counter with a soft thump that raises a tiny puff of dust, and you realize this is no ordinary ledger. This is a record of everything that has happened in this shop, stretching back decades, written in hands that stopped writing long before you were born. Prescription ledgers, he says, answering the question you haven't asked. Every compound I've ever made, every doctor's instruction I've ever followed, every remedy I've ever devised on my own. They're all in here, going back to my grandfather's time. He opens the book to a random page, and you lean in to look. The handwriting is cramped but legible, each entry dated and detailed. You see names you don't recognize, ailments you can barely pronounce, and ingredients that sound more like alchemy than medicine. Mrs. Higgins, dropsy, compound of squill and juniper, take 3 times daily with honey. Mr. Bartholomew, cough of 6 weeks duration, syrup of tolu and morphine, 1 teaspoon at bedtime. Infant child of Mrs. Price, colic, dill water with sodium bicarbonate, small doses as needed. Your finger traces the lines, and you feel the weight of all these people who passed through this shop, described their symptoms, paid their coins, and walked out with folded papers and small bottles. Most of them are dead now. This ledger is decades old, but their ailments live on in these pages, preserved in iron gall ink and the apothecary's careful script. You wonder if any of them got better, or if they just kept coming back with new complaints until eventually they stopped coming at all. This one's interesting, the apothecary says, pointing to an entry near the bottom of the page. Mr. Alistair Finch, melancholia and sleeplessness, compound of valerian and hops with tincture of opium, 1 dram at bedtime, increase as needed. Mr. Finch was a regular for about 3 years. Came in every 2 weeks for more of this mixture. Started with 1 dram, worked his way up to 4 over the course of the first year. By the second year, he was taking 6 drams and complaining it wasn't working anymore. I tried switching the formula, adding different ingredients, but nothing seemed to help. Eventually he stopped coming. I heard later that he'd found a different apothecary who gave him what he wanted without all the questions. He closes the ledger gently. What he wanted, of course, was more opium. What he needed was something else entirely, but I never figured out what. He turns to a different page, this one from earlier in the book's history. The handwriting is different here, older, more ornate, with flourishes on the capitals that suggest a time when penmanship was taught as an art rather than a necessity. My grandfather's hand, the apothecary says. He started this book in 1812. The entries from the first few years are mostly simples, single ingredients for people who knew what they wanted. But as time went on, the compounds became more common. Doctors started sending prescriptions, expecting us to mix them ourselves instead of just handing over the components. By the 1820s, this ledger is mostly compounds, with the doctor's name and the patient's name and the exact formula, all written out in my grandfather's best hand. You study the old entries, noting the differences in the prescriptions themselves. Some are simple. R. valeriani rad. IJ. Aquimenth. Pip. 4. M. That's 2 drams of valerian root mixed with 4 ounces of peppermint water. You learn, a common remedy for nervous complaints. Others are more complex, with half a dozen ingredients measured in scruples and grains and drams, all to be mixed in specific sequences and dispensed in specific forms. You see one prescription that calls for 12 separate components, including something called spiritus aetherus nitrosi, sweet spirit of nitre. The apothecary explains, a now obsolete remedy that was once used for everything from fevers to fainting spells. Historians still argue about the accuracy and completeness of surviving apothecary ledgers. Some were clearly kept as legal records, with every transaction noted in case of disputes or inspections. Others seem more like personal notebooks, with abbreviations and shorthand that only the writer could understand. The best ledgers, like this one, fall somewhere in between, detailed enough to be useful, but flexible enough to accommodate the chaos of real medical practice. You notice that some entries have been crossed out, with notes in the margins explaining why. Patient reported rash, discontinued. Formula ineffective, replaced with alternative. Patient deceased, cause unrelated to treatment. The last one makes you pause, and the apothecary shrugs. People die, he says simply. Sometimes it's the illness, sometimes it's old age, sometimes it's something else entirely. I can't cure everyone, and the ledger reminds me of that. If I only wrote down the successes, I'd start believing I was better than I am. The failures keep me honest. He flips to another section, this one more recent. The handwriting is his own now, familiar from the packets he's given you earlier in the day. The entries are neater than his grandfather's, more standardized, with less ornamentation and more precision. Things changed in the 1840s, he explains. New chemicals started appearing, things my grandfather never would have recognized. Chloroform, chloral hydrate, nitrous oxide. They needed different handling, different measurements, different record keeping. I had to learn new ways of thinking, new ways of writing things down. You notice that some entries in the recent section are marked with a small symbol in the margin, a cross, or maybe an asterisk. The apothecary follows your gaze. Those are the ones I'm not sure about, he says. Formulas that worked for one patient but not another. Ingredients that seemed promising but turned out to have side effects I didn't anticipate. Treatments that I'd use again if I had to, but only with caution and close watching. The symbol reminds me to think twice before mixing that particular compound for anyone else. He runs his finger along the edge of the page. The ledger is full of those now. More than I'd like. But I'd rather have too many warnings than not enough. He closes the book and returns it to its place beneath the counter. But not before you notice one more thing. Near the back of the ledger, tucked between pages, are loose sheets of paper. Prescriptions that haven't been copied into the book yet, or perhaps ones that never will be. Some are written in the same hand as the apothecary's entries, but others are in different hands entirely. Doctor's handwriting, you realize, the notoriously illegible scrawl of physicians dashing off instructions between house calls. One of them you can actually read, and it says something about tincture of iron and quinine sulfate and take 3 times daily for intermittent fever. You wonder who the patient was, and whether the medicine worked, and whether anyone will remember either of them 100 years from now. The apothecary follows your gaze and nods slowly. That's the thing about ledgers, he says quietly. They outlast everyone. The patients die, the doctors die, the apothecaries die. But the books keep going, passed from hand to hand, until eventually someone throws them out, or the mice eat them, or they just fall apart from old age. In the meantime, they hold all these stories, people who lived and suffered and hoped and died, reduced to a few lines of Latin and some numbers in a column. He pats the counter where the ledger rested. It's a kind of immortality, I suppose. Not the kind anyone would choose, but better than nothing. You think about that as you stand there in the quiet shop, surrounded by bottles and drawers and the lingering scent of lavender. Somewhere beneath the counter, in a leather-bound book, your own visit is probably being recorded. The date, your symptoms, the remedies you received, the coins you paid. A few lines in a ledger, added to thousands of others, waiting for someone to read them in some distant future. You wonder what that future person will think of you, and your headache, and the man in the waistcoat who sold you feverfew and willow bark. Probably not much, you decide. But at least you'll be there, preserved in iron gall ink, a small piece of immortality in a shop full of remedies that mostly didn't work. Your eyes drift again to that jar on the low shelf near the corner, the one you noticed when you first entered. The glass is clouded with age and condensation, but you can still make out the shapes inside. Dark, slick, sinuous forms that shift and slide against each other with a patience that seems almost sinister. Leeches. The jar holds perhaps 24 of them, each one maybe 3 inches long when extended, though at the moment they're mostly contracted into tight coils at the bottom of the water. You've heard of leeches, of course, everyone has, but you've never seen them like this, alive and waiting, their purpose clear in the way they're stored and cared for. The apothecary notices your attention and crosses to the jar. He lifts it carefully, holding it up to the light so you can see the creatures more clearly. Their bodies are segmented, darker on the back than on the belly, and they move with a slow, deliberate undulation that seems almost thoughtful. Beautiful, aren't they? He says, and you can't tell if he's being serious. People think of them as pests, as things to be avoided. But they're among the most useful tools I have. When nothing else works, when the blood is too thick or too hot or too full of ill humors, the leeches can often do what medicines cannot. He sets the jar back on its shelf, but leaves it where you can see it clearly. Hirudo medicinalis, he continues, the Latin rolling off his tongue with the same ease as the names of herbs. The medicinal leech. Not just any leech. There are hundreds of species, but only a few are suitable for medical use. These ones come from a supplier in France who breeds them specifically for apothecaries and surgeons. They're clean, healthy, and they know what they're doing. You raise an eyebrow at that last part, and he almost smiles. Figuratively speaking, they have an instinct for where to attach, how deep to bite, how much blood to take. A good leech will do its work and drop off naturally when it's full, no fuss, no complications. You lean closer to the jar, and one of the leeches seems to sense your presence. It extends slightly, its front end reaching toward the glass, and you see the tiny teeth arranged in a tripartite pattern. 3 jaws, each lined with fine denticles, designed to make a Y-shaped incision that won't close easily. The sight should repulse you, and it does, but there's also something fascinating about the creature's single-minded purpose. It doesn't know it's in a jar. It doesn't know it's waiting to be applied to some patient's fevered skin. All it knows is hunger, and the promise of blood, and the patience to wait for both. The theory is simple enough, the apothecary says, settling into a teaching tone. For thousands of years, physicians believed that many illnesses were caused by an excess of blood, or by blood that had become corrupted. Draining some of it would restore the body's balance. Leeches were one way to do that, cleaner than cutting a vein, less painful than cupping, and the leech itself added something to the process, some vital principle that made the bloodletting more effective. He shrugs. Modern doctors are starting to question that theory, but old habits die hard. There are still plenty of physicians who prescribe leeches for everything from headaches to pneumonia, and plenty of patients who insist on them. Historians still argue about how effective leeching actually was, and whether it ever helped anyone or just provided a satisfyingly visible treatment for ailments that would have resolved on their own. Some point to the fact that leeches survived in medical practice well into the 20th century for specific purposes. Reattaching fingers and ears, for instance, where the leech's ability to reduce congestion and promote blood flow actually does help. Others note that leeching was often used on patients who were already weak from illness, and that removing more blood probably hastened their deaths rather than preventing them. The truth, as usual, probably lies somewhere in the messy middle. When do you use them, you ask, and the apothecary considers the question carefully before answering. When a patient presents with signs of inflammation, particularly if the inflammation is localized and the patient is strong enough to tolerate blood loss. A swollen joint, for instance, or an area of skin that's hot and red and painful. Sometimes for headaches that won't respond to other treatments, though that's becoming less common. And sometimes for something called determination of blood to the head, apoplexy, we might call it now, or stroke. The theory is that drawing blood away from the brain can relieve pressure and prevent damage. He pauses. I can't say for certain that it works, but I've seen patients recover after leeching who seemed unlikely to do so otherwise. Whether the leeches deserve the credit, or just the passage of time, I couldn't tell you. He reaches into the jar with a pair of long forceps, and you watch as he gently lifts one of the leeches from the water. The creature extends, its body lengthening as it leaves the liquid, and you see now that it's larger than you thought. Maybe 4 inches fully extended, with a sucker at each end. The apothecary holds it over a small glass bowl, letting it coil there while he reaches for another. I need to move some of them to a different container, he explains. The water needs changing, and I like to give them a little exercise before they're used. A healthy leech is a hungry leech, and a hungry leech does better work. You watch as he transfers half a dozen leeches to the new bowl, their dark bodies sliding against the glass. The process is methodical, almost tender. He handles them with the same care he showed when weighing out your feverfew, as if they were delicate instruments rather than blood-sucking parasites. In a way, you realize, that's exactly what they are to him. Tools of the trade, no different from the mortar and pestle or the brass scales. They have a job to do, and he needs them in good condition to do it. When a patient needs leeching, he continues, I bring them back here, to this room. Not everyone wants to watch, but I prefer to do it where I have good light and everything I need close at hand. The patient rolls up a sleeve or opens a collar, depending on where the leeches need to go. I clean the skin with a little sugar water. Leeches are attracted to sweetness, did you know that? And then I apply the leech with the forceps, holding it gently against the spot until it attaches. He demonstrates the motion with an imaginary leech, his hand steady. They bite quickly, usually within a minute or two. There's a slight pinch, but most patients say it's less painful than a needle. Then they just feed. The feeding process, he explains, can take anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour. The leech swells visibly as it fills with blood, its body expanding to several times its original size. When it's full, it simply releases its grip and falls away, leaving a small wound that continues to ooze for several hours afterward. A feature, not a bug, since the continued bleeding extends the therapeutic effect. The leech is then carefully removed and placed in a recovery container, where it will digest its meal over the course of months before it's ready to be used again. Some leeches, he says, have served him for years, feeding half a dozen times and living quietly in their jar between patients. You look at the leeches with new eyes. They're not just creatures in a jar, they're medical professionals in their own right, each one with a career spanning years, each one contributing to the health of countless patients. The apothecary treats them with respect because they've earned it, because they do a job that nothing else can do quite as well. You think about the thousands of leeches that must have passed through this shop over the decades, each one doing its small part to balance humors and reduce inflammations and, occasionally, to give a patient a visible sign that something was being done. The apothecary finishes transferring the leeches and returns the original jar to its shelf. He wipes his hands on a cloth and turns back to you, his expression thoughtful. "They'll be ready in a day or two," he says. "Mrs. Patterson is coming in on Thursday with her rheumatism. The leeches will do more for her than any powder I could mix." He pats the jar gently, and one of the leeches inside seems to respond, stretching toward his hand through the glass. Funny thing is, she's terrified of them. Has been for years. But she comes anyway, every few months, because she knows they help. That's courage, I think, facing what frightens you because you know it's good for you. He looks at you. Most people never learn to do that. You leave the leeches to their quiet waiting, but you carry the image with you, those dark forms in cloudy water, patient and purposeful, ready to do their work whenever the apothecary calls on them. In a shop full of bottles and powders and instruments, they're the only living medicines, the only treatments that breathe and move and hunger. And somehow, that makes them the most honest things in the room. A glint of marble catches your eye near the front window, and you realize you've been overlooking something obvious. There, against the wall, stands a counter you assumed was just more workspace, but now you see it's different. The top is white marble, veined with gray, polished to a soft gleam. Behind it, attached to the wall, is a large mirror in an ornate frame. And on the counter itself, arranged like soldiers on parade, are gleaming fixtures of brass and glass that you've never seen before. The apothecary follows your gaze and nods toward the setup. "That," he says, "is the future. Or so they keep telling me." He crosses to the marble counter and runs his hand along its cool surface. Soda water, carbonated beverages, fountains that dispense sweet, fizzy drinks to anyone with a few pennies to spare. 20 years ago, this didn't exist. Now I have 3 suppliers competing for my business, and customers who come in asking for sarsaparilla before they even mention their ailments. You approach the fountain, intrigued. The centerpiece is a large marble structure with multiple spigots, each connected to a glass globe containing colorful liquids. Behind it, hidden from view, you hear a faint hissing sound, gas, you realize, being forced into water to create the bubbles that make these drinks distinctive. The apothecary reaches for a glass, holds it under one of the spigots, and pulls a lever. A stream of amber liquid flows out, fizzing and foaming, until the glass is half full. He pushes another lever, and a second stream, clear this time, plain soda water, tops it off. He hands the glass to you. Try it. Root beer, they call it. Sassafras and sarsaparilla, sweetened with molasses, carbonated to make it lively. You take the glass and sip cautiously. The bubbles tickle your nose, and the flavor is unlike anything you've tasted, earthy and sweet and somehow medicinal, which makes sense given its origins. The apothecary watches you drink with the satisfaction of a man showing off a new tool. Good, isn't it? Children love it. So do adults, though many of them pretend they're only drinking it for their health. And that, you learn, is the genius of the soda fountain's placement in an apothecary shop. These fizzy drinks began as medicines, tonics designed to deliver beneficial herbs and minerals in a palatable form. The carbonation was believed to aid digestion, and the sweet syrups masked the bitter taste of the active ingredients. But somewhere along the way, people started drinking them just because they enjoyed them. The medicinal purpose became secondary, then optional, then almost forgotten. Now, the apothecary explains, he sells more soda water than he does most of his actual remedies. The irony isn't lost on me, he says, leaning against the marble counter. I spend my life learning which herbs treat which ailments, how to measure them precisely, how to combine them safely. And what brings people through the door most reliably? Sugar water with bubbles. He gestures at the array of syrup bottles behind the fountain. Ginger, lemon, cherry, raspberry, orange, peppermint, sarsaparilla, sassafras, birch beer, root beer, cola. That one's new, from a pharmacist in Georgia who claims it cures headaches and nervous conditions. Maybe it does. Maybe it doesn't. Either way, people drink it by the gallon. You take another sip of your root beer, and you have to admit it's pleasant, refreshing in a way that plain water isn't, sweet without being cloying. You can see why people would come back for this, even without any pretense of medicinal benefit. The apothecary watches you drink and seems to read your thoughts. It's not all bad, he concedes. The fountain brings in customers who might not otherwise visit an apothecary. Some of them end up buying real medicine while they're here, or asking questions about symptoms they've been ignoring. And the syrups themselves have genuine value. Ginger settles the stomach, peppermint aids digestion, cherry can be soothing for coughs if you prepare it right. The soda water just makes them more appealing. He reaches for a clean glass and prepares one for himself, a simpler combination of plain soda water with a squeeze of lemon. Also, I like the taste. 30 years in this business, and I still enjoy a fizzy drink on a warm afternoon. Historians still argue about exactly when and how the soda fountain transitioned from medical device to social institution. Some point to the 1830s, when improved carbonation equipment made mass production possible. Others credit individual entrepreneurs who saw the commercial potential in selling flavored drinks to a public hungry for novelty. What's certain is that by the middle of the 19th century, apothecary shops across America and Europe were installing marble fountains and competing to offer the most elaborate arrays of syrups and flavors. The apothecary's role was shifting, from pure healer to something more complicated, part merchant and part entertainer, selling pleasure alongside pills. You notice that the fountain area has its own clientele, separate from the customers seeking traditional remedies. A young man in work clothes sits on one of the stools, sipping something dark and reading a newspaper. Two women in fashionable dresses stand at the counter, consulting a list of flavors and debating which to try. A child presses his nose against the glass of the syrup display, pointing at the bright colors and tugging his mother's sleeve. The apothecary moves among them with the same calm efficiency he showed earlier, drawing drinks, collecting coins, wiping spills with a cloth. It's a different rhythm from the careful measuring and grinding you witnessed before. Faster, more casual, less fraught with consequence. If he gets a soda order wrong, nobody dies. This is the part my grandfather wouldn't recognize, the apothecary says, returning to your side. He worked 7 days a week, grinding roots by lamplight, traveling miles to collect rare ingredients. The idea of selling sweet drinks to passing trade would have seemed frivolous to him, maybe even disrespectful. He sips his own soda water. But the world changes, whether we want it to or not. New treatments appear, old ones fade. Diseases that killed thousands become manageable, or disappear entirely. And people find new things to want, new ways to spend their money. I can either adapt or watch my shop empty out. He gestures at the fountain again, a sweep of his hand that takes in the marble, the brass, the colorful syrups. This pays for the leeches. This pays for the jars and the scales and the rent. The medicines I make in the back room, the real work, the work my grandfather taught me, that barely covers its own costs. But the fountain keeps the doors open. He drains his glass and sets it aside. So I smile at the soda drinkers, and I mix their syrups, and I pretend that their fizzy treats are almost as important as the remedies I hand out to people who are actually suffering. And maybe they are, in their own way. Everyone deserves a little pleasure, even if it's just a sweet drink on a summer afternoon. You finish your root beer and set the glass on the counter. The bubbles have settled now, leaving a faint residue of sweetness on your tongue. You look around the shop and see it differently, not just a place of healing, but a place of commerce, of transaction, of people exchanging coins for things they need or want. The bottles on the shelves, the leeches in their jar, the scales and mortars and ledgers. All of it exists because people walk through that door with money in their pockets and desires in their hearts. Some desires are desperate, some are frivolous, but they all keep the shop alive. The apothecary reaches for your glass and places it in a bucket of soapy water beneath the counter. "Another?" he asks, and you shake your head. You have remedies to take, a headache to nurse, a day to get through. But as you turn to leave, you pause and fish another coin from your pocket. "For the child," you say, nodding toward the boy still pressed against the syrup display. The apothecary takes the coin and nods, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Root beer," he says. "Children always want root beer." And you push through the door, the bell clattering behind you, leaving the soda fountain to its steady work of selling sweetness to a world that can always use a little more. The apothecary glances at the clock on the wall, a heavy wooden thing with a painted face and a single swinging pendulum, and his expression shifts almost imperceptibly. "You'll have to excuse me," he says. "It's nearly 6, and my apprentice will be here any moment. The boy needs his instructions, and I need to start the morning preparations before I lose the light." He moves toward the back of the shop, and you follow without being invited, curious to see what the arrival of an apprentice might reveal about the workings of this meticulous world. The front door opens before you reach the back room, and a young man enters, 16, maybe 17, with the gangly limbs and uncertain posture of someone not yet comfortable in his own body. He carries a small satchel and wears clothes that have been mended more than once, but his eyes are bright and his hands, you notice, are already still. He nods to the apothecary with a respect that borders on reverence, then notices you and flushes slightly, uncertain whether to acknowledge a stranger. "You're early," the apothecary says, but there's no reproach in his voice. "Good. We have much to do before the customers arrive." He gestures for the boy to follow, and you find yourself trailing both of them into the back room, where the hanging plants sway gently in some unfelt breeze. The apprentice sets his satchel on the central table and stands at attention, waiting. The apothecary surveys him for a long moment, then nods once. "The morning routine," he says. "Show me you remember." The apprentice doesn't hesitate. He moves to the front of the shop with a purpose that seems almost theatrical after his early uncertainty, and you follow to watch. First, the floor. A broom appears from a closet you hadn't noticed, and the boy begins sweeping with long, even strokes, starting at the back and working toward the front. He's thorough without being fussy, collecting dust and debris from every corner, sweeping it all into a pile near the door. When he's done, he fetches a dustpan and brush, collects the pile, and deposits it in a bin outside the back door. The whole process takes perhaps 10 minutes, and when he returns, the floor already looks different, cleaner, brighter, more welcoming. Next, the bottles. The apprentice moves along the shelves with a feather duster, tickling the glassware with a gentleness that suggests he's been taught to treat each vessel as precious. He doesn't just dust the ones at eye level. He reaches high and low, using a small step stool to access the top shelves, crouching to reach the bottom ones. The duster flicks and dances, and when he's done, the bottles gleam a little more than they did before. You notice that he occasionally pauses to read a label, murmuring the Latin under his breath, and you realize he's studying even as he works, building the mental map that will one day let him find any ingredient without looking. The apothecary watches all of this with an expression that reveals nothing. When the dusting is complete, the apprentice moves to the scales. He checks the balance carefully, adding or removing tiny weights until the beam hangs perfectly level. Then he polishes the pans with a soft cloth, removing any residue from yesterday's work. The brass gleams under his attention, and you see him smile slightly, pleased with the result. The apothecary notices the smile and almost returns it, but catches himself. "The ledger," he says quietly. The apprentice nods and retrieves the heavy book from beneath the counter, laying it flat and opening to a fresh page. He dips a pen in ink and writes the date at the top in a careful, schoolboy hand. Then he waits. The apothecary begins dictating yesterday's sales, today's expected orders, notes on which ingredients need replenishing and which compounds are running low. The apprentice writes it all down, his pen scratching steadily across the page, pausing occasionally to ask for a spelling or clarification. The ledger grows by perhaps 20 lines, each one a record of the shop's ongoing life. Historians still argue about the true nature of the apprenticeship system in 19th century apothecary shops. Some portray it as exploitation, cheap labor for long hours, with the apprentice learning mostly through menial tasks and the occasional grudging lesson. Others describe genuine mentorship, with master apothecaries taking their educational responsibilities seriously and producing skilled practitioners who could eventually open shops of their own. The truth, as with most things, probably varied wildly depending on the individuals involved. Watching this boy work, you suspect you're seeing the better end of the spectrum. A master who expects much but gives much in return, and an apprentice eager to earn his place. When the ledger entries are complete, the apothecary leads the boy to the back room and begins the next lesson. Today, it's compounding a simple cough syrup, honey, lemon, and a tincture of wild cherry bark, all to be mixed in precise proportions and bottled for sale. The apprentice watches as the apothecary demonstrates, then attempts it himself under close supervision. His hands are steady but his measurements are slightly off, and the apothecary makes him pour it out and start again. The second attempt is better, the third nearly perfect. The apothecary nods, and the boy's face lights up with an expression you recognize from your own youth. The joy of getting something right after struggling to learn it. "You'll make 20 more this afternoon," the apothecary says. "Same formula, same care. By the end of the week, you'll be able to do it in your sleep." The apprentice nods, already reaching for another bottle of cherry bark tincture. The apothecary stops him with a hand on his shoulder. "Not now. First, the lamps." The boy's face falls slightly, but he nods and moves to the row of oil lamps along the counter. He trims the wicks, fills the reservoirs, and lights each one with a long taper, adjusting the flames until they burn steady and bright. The shop takes on a warmer glow, the bottles catching the light and throwing colored shadows across the walls. You watch all of this and realize you're seeing something rare, the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next, happening in real time. The apothecary isn't just teaching his apprentice how to make syrup or dust bottles. He's teaching him how to see the shop, how to notice what needs doing before being told, how to care for tools and respect ingredients and treat customers with the right balance of distance and compassion. These are lessons that can't be written down, can't be learned from books. They have to be lived, day after day, until they become instinct. The apprentice finishes the lamps and returns to the back room, where he begins measuring ingredients for the cough syrup he'll be making later. The apothecary watches for a moment, then turns to you. He'll be ready in 3 years, maybe 4. Then he'll move on to another shop, learn different methods, see different patients. Eventually he'll open his own place, and he'll take on an apprentice of his own, and the cycle continues. He shrugs slightly. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked. We teach what we know, and hope the next generation does better with it than we did. You think about all the knowledge stored in this shop, the decades of experience, the thousands of prescriptions, the careful observations of what worked and what didn't. Most of it exists only in the apothecary's head, and in the apprentice's head as it slowly fills with the same information. When the apothecary dies, that knowledge won't disappear completely. Some of it will live on in his student, and in the students after that. But some of it will die with him, the subtle insights and hard-won intuitions that can't be transferred, only absorbed through years of shared work. The apprentice looks up from his measuring and catches you watching. He offers a small, shy smile, then returns to his task. The apothecary has already moved on, checking the leech jar, adjusting a hanging bundle of herbs, making small notes in a pocket notebook. The morning light has grown stronger, and through the front window you can see the street beginning to stir. Shopkeepers opening their doors, early customers heading to market. Soon the bell will start clattering regularly, and the real work of the day will begin. But for now, there's just this quiet moment, with the apprentice measuring and the master observing and the shop slowly coming to life around them both. You slip out quietly, not wanting to break the spell. The bell clatters softly behind you, and you hear the apothecary's voice through the door, already beginning the next lesson. Now, about those leeches. The words fade as you walk away, leaving you with the image of a boy and a man, bent over a jar of dark creatures, continuing a tradition that stretches back centuries and will stretch forward into a future none of them can see. You're barely half a block from the shop when you realize you left without asking one final question. Something about the willow bark powder and whether it might interfere with the feverfew. You turn back, push through the door, and find the apothecary already engaged with a customer. The bell announces your return, but neither of them looks up. They're standing at the counter, heads close together, speaking in low tones that don't carry beyond their immediate circle. You hang back near the door, not wanting to interrupt, but unable to resist watching the consultation unfold. The customer is a woman, perhaps 40, dressed in the plain but clean clothing of a tradesman's wife. She's not describing her symptoms. Not directly, anyway. Instead, she's answering questions, her voice barely audible even in the quiet shop. The apothecary listens with an intensity that transforms his face, all his attention focused on her words and on the subtle cues of her posture and expression. Occasionally he asks a follow-up, or requests clarification, or nods encouragingly when she hesitates. You've never seen anyone listen to so completely, and you understand suddenly that this is its own kind of skill, perhaps the most important skill in the entire shop. "Show me," the apothecary says quietly, and the woman hesitates, glancing around the shop. Her eyes pass over you without recognition. You're just part of the furniture to her now, irrelevant to the moment. She turns slightly, lifts the edge of her shawl, and reveals her wrist. It's swollen, you see, the skin red and tight-looking, with a warmth that's almost visible. The apothecary leans closer, not touching, just looking. Then he asks if he may examine, and she nods, and his fingers rest gently on the inflamed skin, testing temperature and texture and the subtle give of the tissues beneath. "Tell me again about the fever," he says, and she does. 3 days ago it started, with chills and shaking. Then the wrist began to ache, then to swell, then to redden. The fever comes and goes, worse at night, better in the morning. She's tried poultices, tried resting it, tried a patent medicine her sister recommended. Nothing helps. The apothecary nods through all of this, his face giving nothing away, but you notice his eyes flick briefly toward the poison cabinet, then away. Not that, then. Or maybe not yet. He straightens and reaches for a drawer, not the poison cabinet, but one of the regular ones near the counter. From it he takes a small jar containing a pale yellowish powder. "Arnica," he says, more to himself than to the woman, "and perhaps some calendula for the inflammation." He sets the jar aside and reaches for another drawer, this one containing dried leaves. He crumbles a small amount between his fingers, brings them to his nose, inhales deeply. "Comfrey," he murmurs, "for the deeper tissues." He continues this way for several minutes, assembling a collection of jars and packets on the counter, each one considered and either set aside or returned to its drawer. The woman watches him with an expression you recognize, the same hopeful wariness you felt when you first entered. She wants to believe he can help, but she's been disappointed before, by doctors and remedies and promises that didn't keep. The apothecary seems to sense this without looking at her. "I'll make you a poultice," he says. "Arnica and calendula for the surface, comfrey for what's underneath. You'll apply it warm, wrap it in clean cloth, change it twice a day. The fever should ease within 2 days. If it doesn't, come back and we'll try something else." He pauses, finally meeting her eyes. "If it gets worse, if the redness spreads or the pain becomes unbearable, come back immediately, even if it's the middle of the night. Do you understand?" She nods, and he begins compounding. This is different from the careful weighing you witnessed earlier. Faster, more intuitive, though no less precise. He measures by eye and by feel, adding a pinch of this, a handful of that, mixing everything in a small mortar with just enough hot water to form a paste. The smell that rises is complex and green, like a garden after rain. He spreads the paste on a square of clean linen, folds it, wraps it in oilcloth, and hands it to the woman with instructions for reheating and reapplying. She pays, tucks the packet into her basket, and leaves without another word. The door clatters behind her, and the shop is quiet again. Historians still argue about the diagnostic abilities of 19th century apothecaries. Without modern tools, no stethoscopes, no thermometers, no blood tests, they had to rely on observation and intuition, on years of experience reading the language of the human body. Some were undoubtedly better at it than others, and the best developed skills that bordered on the uncanny. They could spot a fever from the quality of a patient's skin, diagnose a digestive complaint from the subtle sounds of the gut, recognize the early signs of diseases that wouldn't fully manifest for weeks. It wasn't science as we understand it today, but it was a kind of knowing, deep and practical and hard one. The apothecary turns to you, and for a moment his expression is distant, still processing the consultation. Then he seems to remember who you are, and his face relaxes. "You had another question," he says. "It's not a guess. He noticed you leave, noticed you return, and deduced the reason. You nod and ask about the willow bark and feverfew, and he answers patiently, explaining how they work differently and can safely be combined. But you're only half listening, still thinking about the woman and her swollen wrist, about the way he listened to her and looked at her and somehow understood what was wrong. "Does it always work?" you ask when he's finished. He considers the question longer than it deserves, or maybe exactly as long as it deserves. "No," he says finally. "Sometimes I'm wrong. Sometimes the poultice doesn't help, or makes things worse, or the patient comes back a week later with the same symptoms and I have to admit I don't know what's causing them. Sometimes they go to a doctor instead, and the doctor bleeds them or doses them with mercury, and they die anyway, and I wonder if I could have saved them if I'd been more certain, more aggressive, more something." He's quiet for a moment. "But sometimes it works. Sometimes they get better, and they come back months later to thank me, and they bring me a chicken or a loaf of bread or just a smile and a kind word. Those moments make the rest bearable." You think about the weight of that responsibility, having to decide, based on a few minutes of conversation and observation, what's wrong with someone and what might fix it. The apothecary doesn't have the luxury of running tests or consulting specialists. He has his eyes, his ears, his hands, and his memory of thousands of similar cases stretching back decades. And on that foundation, he builds a diagnosis and a treatment, knowing that if he's wrong, someone might suffer or die. It's a burden you wouldn't wish on anyone, yet he carries it daily, for every patient who walks through the door. The apothecary returns to his work, but you linger, watching him move through the shop. He checks the leech jar, adjusts a label that's starting to curl, sweeps a few stray crumbs from the counter. The rhythm of his movements is different now. Slower, more reflective, still processing the consultation even as his hands occupy themselves with routine tasks. You realize that for him, the work never really stops. Every patient stays with him, filed away in some mental cabinet, available for future reference when a similar case appears. The woman with the swollen wrist will join thousands of others in that cabinet, her symptoms and her treatment and her outcome all preserved in the only record that matters, his memory. You thank him for the advice about the willow bark, and he nods absently, already reaching for a new task. As you leave, you glance back and see him standing at the counter, staring at nothing, his lips moving slightly as if rehearsing a conversation. Maybe he's going over the details of the case, checking his reasoning, preparing for the woman's possible return. Or maybe he's just taking a moment to breathe, to reset, to prepare for the next consultation that will walk through the door with its own mysteries and its own demands. Either way, you leave him to it, the bell clattering softly behind you as you step back into the ordinary world. The afternoon light has shifted, growing warmer and more golden as it slants through the front window. You found a small bench near the door, and the apothecary has apparently decided you're harmless enough to ignore while he works. The apprentice is still in the back room, probably compounding his cough syrup, and for a few moments the shop is quiet except for the ticking of the clock and the faint hiss of the soda fountain's gas supply. Then the apothecary emerges from the back carrying a small ceramic dish, and you see that the real work of the day is about to begin. He sets the dish on the counter and begins arranging tools. A small spatula, a glass slab, a bottle of something that looks like honey but darker, and a container of fine white powder. From a drawer he produces a small brass device that you don't recognize. Two hinged plates with concave surfaces, like a mold for something small and round. He catches your curious look and gestures you closer. "Pills," he says. "I have a patient coming this evening who needs a course of something that can't be taken as a powder or a tincture. So I'll make them into pills." He opens the container of white powder and tips some onto the glass slab. This is licorice root powder, not for any medicinal reason, but because it binds well and tastes pleasant. The actual medicine goes in next. From a small jar, he adds a tiny amount of a dark resinous substance, measuring it carefully with the tip of his spatula. "Jalap root," he explains. "A powerful purgative. Too much and the patient will wish they'd never been born. Too little and nothing happens. This has to be exactly right." He works the resin into the powder with the spatula, cutting and folding until the mixture is uniform. Then he adds the dark liquid, not honey, you now see, but something thicker and more aromatic. "Simple syrup," he says. "Sugar and water, boiled down until it's sticky. It holds everything together and makes the pill easier to swallow." He continues mixing, and gradually the dry powder transforms into a moist, cohesive mass that he gathers into a ball. It looks like bread dough, if bread dough were made of medicine and meant to be eaten by the desperately constipated. Now comes the part that requires the brass device. The apothecary divides the ball into smaller pieces, rolling each one between his palms until it forms a long, thin rope about the thickness of a pencil. He lays these ropes on the glass slab, then takes the brass device. It's called a pill tile, he explains, or sometimes a pill machine, and places one of the ropes in the groove of the bottom plate. The top plate has corresponding grooves, and when he presses it down and rolls it back and forth, the rope is cut into equal segments, each one rolled into a perfect sphere by the action of the grooves. He opens the device, and there, lined up in neat rows, are a dozen identical pills. You lean in to look. They're small, maybe a 1/4 inch across, perfectly round, and surprisingly uniform. The apothecary picks one up and examines it critically, then nods and sets it aside. "Not bad," he says. "A little rough on the surface, but that will smooth out as they dry." He repeats the process with the remaining ropes until he has perhaps 50 pills, all identical, all waiting for their final treatment. From another drawer he produces a small bowl of fine powder, lily root starch, he says, and tips the pills into it, swirling them gently until each one is coated in a thin white layer. Prevents them from sticking together, he explains. Also makes them look more professional. Patients expect pills to be white and smooth. If they're brown and lumpy, people don't trust them. He transfers the coated pills to a shallow tray and sets them on a high shelf where air can circulate. They'll dry overnight, he says. Tomorrow I'll count them into papers, write the instructions, and have them ready when the patient arrives. He cleans his tools methodically, wiping the glass slab and the pill tile, returning the spatula to its drawer. The whole process has taken perhaps 40 minutes, and the result is a tray of 50 identical pills that will do exactly what they're supposed to do, no more and no less. Historians still argue about the effectiveness of pills compared to other forms of medication. Some patients preferred them because they were easier to swallow than bitter powders or bulky tinctures. Others distrusted them because it was harder to tell what was inside. With a powder, you could at least see the ingredients. With a pill, you had to trust the apothecary's word. The best practitioners understood this and took care to make their pills as consistent and professional looking as possible, building trust through appearance as much as through results. What about the ones that aren't so pleasant? You ask, and the apothecary raises an eyebrow. You mean the ones that taste terrible, or the ones that do terrible things? Both, you admit. He chuckles softly and reaches for another drawer. For terrible taste, we have coatings. Sugar, if the patient can afford it. Licorice, if they can't. Sometimes even gold leaf, for the very wealthy, though that's more for show than for taste. He produces a small bottle of dark brown liquid. For terrible effects. Well, sometimes there's nothing to be done. If the medicine works by making the patient vomit or purge, they're going to vomit or purge no matter how pretty the pill is. The best we can do is warn them, and maybe give them something soothing to take afterward. He shows you another pill-making device, this one simpler. 2 wooden boards, each with hemispherical indentations, that clamp together to form spheres. For when I need a lot of pills quickly, he says. You roll the mass into ropes, lay them in the bottom board, press the top board down, and open it up. 50 pills in one press, all perfectly formed. He demonstrates with a piece of bread dough left over from lunch, and you watch as a dozen perfect bread balls emerge from the press. The trick is getting the consistency right. Too wet, and they stick to the boards. Too dry, and they crumble instead of forming. It takes practice. You think about the sheer amount of practice required to do this work well. The apothecary didn't learn pill making in a week or a month. He learned it over years, making thousands of pills, each one a little better than the last, until the process became as natural as breathing. His apprentice will go through the same process, starting with lumpy failures and gradually working up to pills that would satisfy the most demanding patient. By the time he's ready to open his own shop, he'll be able to make pills in his sleep, just as the apothecary said. A customer enters, not the one expected for the pills, but someone else, here for something simple. The apothecary serves her quickly, barely interrupting his cleaning, and returns to you when she's gone. The interesting thing about pills, he says, picking up the conversation as if no time had passed, is that they're becoming more popular. 20 years ago, most people wanted powders or liquids. Now, with all these new machines and presses, pills are easier to make and more consistent. Patients trust them more. And they're easier to transport, easier to store, easier to take on a journey. He gestures at the tray of drying pills. 50 of those will fit in a small box that a man can carry in his pocket. Try doing that with 50 doses of liquid medicine. He wipes his hands on his apron and surveys the shop with a satisfied expression. The pills are drying, the tools are clean, the afternoon light is fading toward evening. Soon the patient will arrive for his purgative pills, and the apothecary will explain how to take them and what to expect, and the transaction will be complete. Another remedy, another patient, another day in the long life of the shop. You realize you've been here for hours, absorbed in the rhythms of this place, and you still haven't taken your own remedies. The headache is gone now, faded to a distant memory, but you touch the packets in your pocket anyway, grateful for the small miracles they represent. The apothecary notices the gesture and nods slowly. "Take them," he says. "The feverfew first, with a little honey if you like. The willow bark tonight if the headache returns, but not otherwise. And come back if you need more, or if anything changes." He turns away, reaching for another task, and you know it's time to go. The door clatters behind you one last time, and you step out into the cooling evening, the image of 50 perfect pills still vivid in your mind. Each one identical, each one effective, each one the product of decades of practice and a single afternoon's careful work. The evening post has arrived. You notice this because the apothecary, who has been steadily working through the afternoon tasks, straightens suddenly at the sound of footsteps on the cobblestones outside. A moment later, a young boy appears at the door, not a customer, but a messenger, his satchel bulging with letters and small packages. He hands a bundle to the apothecary, receives a coin in return, and disappears back into the gathering dusk as quickly as he arrived. The apothecary carries the bundle to the counter and begins sorting through it with the same methodical attention he gives to everything else. Most of the items are letters, their envelopes addressed in a variety of hands, some elegant and flowing, others cramped and nearly illegible. A few are small wooden boxes, tied with string and sealed with wax. These he sets aside for later inspection, giving them an extra glance that suggests they contain something more delicate or more valuable than paper. "Country orders," he explains, noticing your continued presence. "Doctors from outlying villages, farmers who can't make the trip themselves, former patients who've moved away but still trust my compounds. They write with their needs, I prepare the medicines, and the post carries them back." He holds up one of the letters, its envelope smudged and travel-worn. "This one's from Dr. Morrison, 3 days' ride to the north. He's been sending me his prescriptions for 15 years, ever since he decided the local apothecary couldn't be trusted with anything more complicated than castor oil." He breaks the seal and unfolds the letter, scanning its contents with the practiced speed of someone who's read thousands of similar messages. "Quinine, for malaria. Digitalis, for a heart patient. Chloroform, for a difficult childbirth he's expecting next month. And..." He pauses, frowning slightly. "Laudanum, a larger quantity than usual." He doesn't say why. He sets the letter aside and reaches for another. Dr. Morrison is careful with his requests. If he's asking for extra laudanum, there's a reason. I'll prepare it and trust his judgment. You watch as he works through the stack, each letter receiving the same attention. A quick reading, a mental note of the required items, and then placement in one of several piles according to urgency or complexity. The wooden boxes are opened next, revealing their contents: a small jar of honey from a former patient, a bundle of dried herbs from someone who grows her own and wants the apothecary's opinion on their quality, a carefully wrapped piece of amber that a country doctor found in a stream and thought might have medicinal properties. The apothecary examines each item with interest, setting aside the honey for later tasting, the herbs for identification, the amber for a shelf where such curiosities accumulate. "The post is how I stay connected," he says, returning to the letters. "Without it, I'd only know what happens in this town, within walking distance of this shop. With it, I have patients and colleagues spread across half the country. I know which remedies work in the mountains and which fail by the sea. I know which doctors are reliable and which are dangerous. I know when a new epidemic is spreading because the orders for certain medicines start arriving from places that never asked for them before." He taps the stack of letters. "This is my early warning system. This is how I prepare for what's coming before it arrives. Historians still argue about the role of mail in 19th century medical practice. Some emphasize the isolation of rural communities and the dependence on whatever remedies could be produced locally. Others point to the extensive correspondence networks that connected apothecaries, doctors, and patients across vast distances, creating a kind of distributed medical system that operated through letters and packages rather than personal visits. The truth probably involves both isolation and connection, with the mail serving as a lifeline for those far from cities while never fully replacing the value of face-to-face consultation. The apothecary reaches for a fresh sheet of paper and dips his pen in ink. "I'll need to respond to these tonight," he says. Dr. Morrison will expect his order within the week, and the post only runs twice more before then. He begins writing, his hand moving steadily across the page. You watch the words form, acknowledgements of orders, questions about symptoms, suggestions for alternative treatments, warnings about potential interactions. The letter to Dr. Morrison is businesslike but respectful, confirming each requested item and noting the extra laudanum without comment. Another letter, to a farmer's wife who wrote asking about a persistent cough, is gentler, full of questions about the cough's character and duration before any mention of remedies. Between letters, he consults his ledgers, checking what's in stock and what needs to be prepared. The quinine for Dr. Morrison is running low. He makes a note to order more from his supplier. The digitalis is plentiful, harvested just last month and dried to perfect potency. The chloroform he'll need to compound himself, a delicate process involving chlorine and alcohol that requires his full attention. The laudanum is already prepared, stored in the poison cabinet, waiting to be measured and bottled. He writes all of this down, creating a to-do list for the coming days that will guide his work long after you've gone home to your own evening. A particular letter catches his attention, and he reads it twice before setting it down. "This one's unusual," he says, almost to himself. You wait. And after a moment he continues. A doctor in the next county reports a cluster of cases. Fever, jaundice, abdominal pain. He's tried the usual treatments and nothing works. He's asking if I've seen anything similar, or if I know of any remedy he hasn't thought of. He taps the letter thoughtfully. I haven't seen it. Not here. But I've read about something like it, in a journal from France. Yellow fever, they called it, though that's usually coastal. I'll write back with what I know, and hope it helps. He adds a note to his response, then sets the letter in a separate pile. The one for things that need more thought, more research, more consultation of his books before he can answer properly. The stack of completed responses grows beside him, each one a small connection between this quiet shop and some distant patient or colleague. By the time he's finished, the lamp has burned low and the street outside is fully dark, lit only by the occasional flicker of a passing carriage. You realize you've been here much longer than you intended. The headache that brought you is long forgotten, replaced by a growing appreciation for the complexity of this man's life and work. He's not just a shopkeeper, not just a healer. He's a node in a network that stretches across the countryside, a source of knowledge and material for people who have no other access to either. The letters on his counter represent dozens of lives, dozens of illnesses, dozens of hopes that something in this shop might make a difference. The apothecary begins gathering his responses, stacking them neatly and tying them with string for tomorrow's post. The wooden boxes are repacked with the medicines they'll carry back to their senders, each one labeled and sealed against the journey. The work of the evening is nearly done, and soon he'll close up the shop, eat a simple supper, and perhaps read a few pages from one of his medical journals before sleep. Tomorrow the cycle will begin again, with new customers and new letters and new mysteries to solve. You stand to leave, and the apothecary glances up. The willow bark, he says. Take it if you need it, but don't make a habit of it. Some remedies work best when they're used sparingly. You nod, touch your hat, and push through the door into the night. The bell clatters behind you, and you hear the lock turn as the apothecary secures the shop for the evening. Above you, the stars are coming out, and somewhere in the darkness, a horse-drawn cart rattles toward the next town, carrying letters and packages and the quiet work of a man you barely knew this morning but now feel you understand a little better. You're almost out the door when you notice something that makes you pause. The apothecary has moved to a small cabinet near the back of the shop. Not the poison cabinet, but something more personal, less accessible to customers. From it he takes a small bottle and a spoon, and before you can look away, he pours a dark liquid into the spoon and swallows it in a single practice motion. His eyes meet yours over the spoon, and for a moment neither of you speaks. Then he shrugs slightly, returns the bottle to the cabinet, and resumes his work as if nothing has happened. You find yourself drifting back toward the counter, curiosity overcoming discretion. The apothecary doesn't seem surprised. If anything, he looks almost relieved, as if he's been waiting for someone to notice, to ask, to give him an excuse to explain. He sets down the cloth he was using to wipe the counter and leans against it, his weight settling into the wood like a man preparing for a long story. "You're wondering what I just took," he says. "It's not a question." You nod, and he continues. "Strychnine. In very small doses. It's for my digestion, which has been troublesome since I was young. 1/10 of a grain with each meal, and the spasms ease." He sees your expression and almost smiles. "Yes, I know. Strychnine is a poison. In larger doses, it causes convulsions and death. In smaller doses, it stimulates the nervous system, improves digestion, and sometimes even helps with certain kinds of weakness or paralysis. The difference is a matter of measurement, nothing more." You think about the poison cabinet, with its locked drawer and careful records. The strychnine in there is for patients, dispensed in tiny quantities under close supervision. But this strychnine, the bottle in the personal cabinet, is for the apothecary himself, taken daily, monitored only by his own judgment of how his body responds. It's one thing to trust your measurements when someone else's life depends on them. It's another thing entirely to trust them with your own. "How long?" you ask, and he understands immediately. 23 years. Since I was about your age. Maybe a little younger. A doctor recommended it after other treatments failed, and I've taken it ever since." He touches his stomach unconsciously. "Some days I wonder if it's still helping, or if I'm just accustomed to it. Some days I wonder if I could stop, or if stopping would make things worse. But I keep taking it, because it's worked so far, and because..." He trails off, searching for words. "Because it's mine. My own medicine, chosen for my own body, measured by my own hand. There's something reassuring about that." Historians still argue about the extent to which 19th century apothecaries used their own products. Some were clearly believers, taking the same remedies they sold to customers and sometimes becoming their own best advertisements. Others were more skeptical, recognizing that many of their treatments were at best harmless and at worst dangerous, and quietly avoiding them in their private lives. The truth, as always, was probably mixed. Some apothecaries genuinely trusted their medicines, while others took them only when necessary and preferred to let customers be the guinea pigs. The apothecary reaches for a jar on the counter and opens it, revealing a dark, sticky mass that smells faintly of licorice. "This is another one I take regularly," he says. "Black draught, they call it. A mixture of senna and other herbs that keeps the bowels moving. It's not pleasant, but it's effective, and it prevents problems that would require stronger measures later." He breaks off a small piece and chews it thoughtfully, his face wrinkling slightly at the taste. "You see, I'm not just selling these things. I'm living with them. If a remedy causes unpleasant side effects, I know because I've experienced them. If it works, I know because I've felt it work. That knowledge informs everything I do behind this counter. You think about the implications of that. Every time the apothecary recommends a treatment, he's drawing on personal experience as well as professional knowledge. He knows what it feels like to take strychnine, to chew black draught, to swallow the same bitter powders he measures for his patients. It doesn't make him infallible. His body is different from theirs, his conditions different from theirs, but it gives him a perspective that purely academic training never could. He's not just a dispenser of remedies. He's a fellow traveler on the same uncertain journey. What about the ones that don't work? You ask. The ones that are useless, or worse than useless. Do you take those too? The apothecary considers the question carefully before answering. No, he says finally. I don't take the ones I know are worthless. But I've taken some that I thought might work and discovered they didn't. I've taken some that worked for a while and then stopped. I've taken some that worked but caused side effects I couldn't tolerate, and I've had to find alternatives. He gestures at the shop around him. Everything in here has passed through my body at some point, or through the bodies of people I trust. Not all at once, obviously, that would kill me. But over the years, I've tested most of what I sell. It's the only way to be sure. He reaches for the bottle of strychnine again, uncorks it, and holds it up to the light. The liquid inside is almost clear, faintly amber, innocuous looking. This is the one that worries me most, he admits. Not because it's dangerous, I know how to measure it, and I've never come close to an overdose. But because it's addictive. Not in the way opium is addictive, not with craving and withdrawal, but in a subtler way. My body has come to expect it, to rely on it. If I stopped taking it, I don't know what would happen. The digestive problems might return, or they might not. But I'd have to find out, and that's a risk I'm not ready to take. You look at the bottle with new eyes. It's not just medicine anymore. It's a dependency, a habit, a choice made so long ago that it's become invisible. The apothecary takes his strychnine every day because he's always taken it, because the alternative is unknown and therefore frightening. You wonder how many of his patients are in the same position, dependent on remedies they started taking years ago and can't imagine stopping. You wonder if the apothecary ever thinks about that when he hands over a fresh bottle of laudanum or a new packet of arsenic. He returns the bottle to the cabinet and closes the door firmly. The point is, he says, turning back to you, I believe in what I do. Not because I'm naive, and not because I think every remedy in this shop is a miracle cure, but because I've lived with them, tested them, learned their limits and their possibilities. When I tell a patient that something will help, I'm not guessing. I'm speaking from experience, theirs, mine, and everyone who came before us. He touches the cabinet door almost tenderly. That's why I take my own medicine. It keeps me honest. You stand there in the fading light, watching a man who has spent his life surrounded by remedies, and you understand something new about him. He's not just a merchant or a healer or a scientist. He's a participant in the same experiment as his patients, testing the same compounds, risking the same side effects, hoping for the same outcomes. The line between healer and healed is thinner than you thought. Maybe it doesn't exist at all. We're all just bodies moving through the world, trying to find something that makes the pain stop, the digestion work, the sleep come easier. The apothecary just happens to have a shop full of potential answers, and the courage to try them on himself first. You thank him for his honesty, and he nods as if accepting a compliment he's not sure he deserves. The evening has deepened into true night now, and the shop is lit only by a single lamp near the counter. The bottles on the shelves have retreated into shadow, their colors visible only as hints and suggestions. The apothecary's face is half in darkness, half in light, and for a moment he looks older than he did this morning. Tired, perhaps, or just contemplative. You leave him there, standing among his remedies, and step out into the night with the image of a man swallowing his own medicine burned into your memory. The last customer has gone. The apprentice has been sent home with instructions for tomorrow and a small packet of cough syrup for his younger sister, who's been suffering through the night. The soda fountain has been wiped down, its syrups covered with clean cloths to keep out dust and curious insects. The scales sit empty on their marble square, the weights return to their velvet box, the pans gleaming in the lamplight. And you're still here, somehow, drawn into the final ritual of the day without quite intending to be. The apothecary moves through the shop with a different quality now. Slower, more deliberate, as if each action carries the weight of the day behind it. He checks each drawer's label, though you suspect he knows perfectly well that they're all in place. He runs a cloth along the counter, collecting invisible crumbs and smudges. He straightens a bottle that was already straight, adjusts a jar that was already perfectly positioned. These are not tasks that need doing. They're rituals, habits, ways of saying goodnight to a place that holds his life between its walls. At the poison cabinet, he pauses longer than elsewhere. He doesn't open it, the day's transactions are done, and nothing inside needs attention until morning. But he rests his hand on the brass lock for a moment, as if checking that it's still there, still secure, still doing its job. Then he moves on, his fingers trailing along the edge of the counter as he goes. You follow at a distance, not wanting to intrude but unable to leave, caught in the spell of this closing ceremony. The lamp nearest the door is the first to be extinguished. He turns the wick down slowly, watching the flame shrink and dance, then blows gently across the chimney. The glass cools with a soft ping, and the corner of the shop falls into shadow. He moves to the next lamp, and the next, each one receiving the same careful attention. The shop darkens gradually, retreating into itself, the bottles losing their color and becoming mere shapes against the walls. By the time he reaches the last lamp, the one on the counter where he's worked all day, only a small pool of light remains, illuminating his hands and the immediate surface around them. From a drawer beneath the counter, he produces a small leather pouch and appends it onto the wood. Coins spill out, copper and silver, a few gold pieces among them, and begin their evening ritual. He sorts them by denomination, stacking the copper in neat piles, arranging the silver in rows, setting the gold aside for separate counting. His fingers move quickly, almost automatically, tallying the day's earnings while his mind is clearly elsewhere. You watch the stacks grow, and you realize you're seeing something intimate. The moment when the day's work becomes numbers, when effort and skill and human interaction are reduced to a sum that can be recorded in a ledger. Not a bad day, he murmurs, more to himself than to you. Better than yesterday, worse than last week. It averages out. He reaches for a small notebook and writes the total in a column, then adds a few notes. New customer, headache, feverfew, and willow bark. Mrs. Patterson's rheumatism, leeches ordered, Dr. Morrison's letter, quinine, and digitalist to prepare. You see yourself reduced to a line in that notebook, and you feel a strange satisfaction at being recorded, at having existed in this shop for a few hours and left a mark, however small. The coins go back into the pouch into its drawer, the notebook into its place beside the ledgers. The apothecary straightens one last time and looks around the darkened shop with an expression you can't quite read. Satisfaction. Maybe. Weariness. Certainly. And something else, a kind of affection, the feeling you might have for an old friend who's been with you through good times and bad and is still standing, still ready for whatever comes next. I used to hate this part of the day, he says quietly. When I was young, when the shop was new and every customer felt like a test I might fail. Closing up meant admitting that the day was over, that I'd done everything I could and now had to wait until tomorrow to find out if it was enough. He shakes his head slightly. Now I look forward to it. The quiet. The chance to breathe. The knowledge that for a few hours, no one needs anything from me, and I can just be here, with all of this, without having to perform or explain or justify. He moves to the front window and looks out at the street. It's empty now, the cobblestones gleaming faintly in the light of a distant gas lamp. A cat crosses silently, disappearing into an alley. Somewhere a dog barks once and falls silent. The world has gone to sleep, or is getting ready to, and this small shop with its bottles and drawers and leeches and scales is holding the darkness at bay for just a little longer. Historians still argue about what motivated 19th century apothecaries to do what they did. Some emphasize the commercial aspect, the desire for profit, the competition for customers, the constant pressure to sell more and charge more. Others focus on the scientific curiosity, the genuine desire to understand disease and find effective treatments. A few point to the social role, the way apothecaries functioned as community anchors, sources of advice and comfort as much as of medicine. Standing here in the dark, watching this man close his shop for the night, you suspect the truth is simpler and more complicated at the same time. He does this because it's what he does, because it's who he is, because the shop and the man have become inseparable over decades of shared mornings and evenings. He turns from the window and notices you still there, still watching. For a moment you think he might ask you to leave, to give him the privacy of these final moments. But instead he gestures toward the door, inviting you to join him in one last look at the night. You step forward, and together you stand at the window, gazing out at the empty street, the sleeping city, the vast darkness that holds everything that isn't this small circle of lamplight. "It'll be here tomorrow," he says finally. "The shop, I mean. The bottles, the drawers, the leeches, all of it. I'll open the door, and the bell will ring, and someone will come in with a headache or a cough or a worry, and I'll do what I can to help." He pauses. "And someday I won't. Someday the door won't open, or someone else will open it, and the shop will go on without me. But not yet. Not tonight." He reaches for the last lamp and turns the wick down. The flame shrinks, gutters, and goes out, plunging the shop into complete darkness. You stand there for a moment, disoriented, until your eyes begin to adjust. Faint light from the street seeps through the window, outlining the bottles, the counter, the shape of the apothecary beside you. He's not moving, just standing, breathing, being present in the space he's inhabited for so long. Then he turns toward the back room, where you know a small cot waits, and his voice comes out of the darkness, softer now, almost a whisper. "Go home. Take your remedies. Sleep if you can. And if you dream of this place, dream gently." You hear his footsteps fade toward the back, and then nothing but the settling creaks of an old building and the distant sound of a clock striking somewhere in the night. You find the door by touch, your hand closing on the familiar iron handle. The bell doesn't ring when you open it. You catch it with your other hand, muffling its voice, not wanting to break the silence any more than necessary. Then you're outside, on the cobblestones, the door closed behind you, the shop a dark shape against the star-scattered sky. You walk away slowly, your footsteps loud in the quiet street, and behind you the shop waits in darkness for the morning, for the bell, for the next customer with a headache and a handful of coins and a hope that someone might be able to help. So now the day is done, and you're walking home through streets that are finally quieted, the packets of feverfew and willow bark still warm from your pocket against your thigh. The apothecary is asleep by now, or lying awake thinking of Mrs. Patterson's rheumatism and Dr. Morrison's laudanum and the young man who watched him close up shop and didn't leave until the very end. Tomorrow it will all begin again, the grinding and measuring, the consultations and compounds, the steady rhythm of a life lived in service to bottles and drawers and the people who need what they contain. But tonight there's just this, the cool air on your face, the distant stars, and the quiet satisfaction of having spent a day in a place where someone knows exactly where everything belongs and what everything is for. Sleep well, and dream of lavender and brass scales and the soft sound of a mortar grinding roots into remedy.